I feel like I learned about boundaries like as a concept at some point when my mother was explaining to me when I was a kid, people without boundaries. And she was like, so I'm cold, so you should put on a sweater.
Whoa.
This is when Patrick became really enamored of my mother.
That's a great line.
I think he was like, could you explain everything in like one sentence like that?
Very, very good.
It's so good. It's so good. That's amazing.
And I was just thinking about it as I was putting on my sweater this morning.
You're like, who am I putting on a sweater for?
Yeah, exactly. But it was such an interesting thing to like learn about the idea of boundaries through not like this, what you write about in terms of like, walls and autonomy. And like, I think of this as also like the rhetoric of like classical liberal political philosophy also, but through like the absence. Like, so to learn about boundaries as a thing that like you should be aware that some people don't have. And that could be like a thing to be very wary of.
Totally. Well, I think that's like always how it's constructed kind of, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to like get too far into the history, but like if Edith Jacobson is kind of the person in ego psychology who really sets up this idea of differentiation as like a telos for individual development, like I'm pretty sure she was a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah.
So there's this sort of, we must have boundaries because previously everything was undifferentiated and we were just like staring at a mass of like Leni Riefenstahl style Nazis, all of whom are just like sort of like a glom of undifferentiated ego. And then if we just can like keep all of those people apart from each other, then somehow, we will be able to dismantle fascism. So I think like there's that fantasy or like sort of there's this avoidance of the originary crowd that always like predates actually imposing the boundaries.
Yeah, your work is so good about weaving. I'll just get this out there to begin with. Like your work is brilliant and you're a magnificent stylist. And one thing that I particularly admire in your work is the way that you can weave together historical developments in political economy and sort of these histories of both the academic development and popularization, but then also like the self-help, like therapy language uses of terms that are really overdetermined in all those domains. And I have to be a little more careful about what I can disclose, but I will say that I learned about boundaries through doing therapy, and coming from a background of Irish Catholic and then Polish Catholic sort of diasporic communities, albeit in slightly different generational cadres, the idea of boundaries being something, well, globally speaking, right? Does Poland have boundaries? I mean, like, when are we talking about, right? But also the question of like the way in which state repression and processes of imperialism and colonialism then ramify in terms of like how you internally sort of police your own boundaries. Let me just say that I came across some scanned copies of IRA like training manuals, and they're pretty amazing. These are people like graphic design was their passion, right? So they're clipping things together from various sources and typewriting, and using little bits of fashion magazines and stuff. But it was all these injunctions: don't tell anyone anything. Do not tell your priest. If you are at the pub, you do not tell the lads. Do not tell your sister, no matter how proud you are of what you were doing. And it was like, okay, so the family, which is this unit that's getting this kind of state pressure, the question of like when or you can or can't let down your guard it's related to all these, like, are people going to be turned? Is someone going to get like loose lips, like sinking your, I don't know, like your arms cache because you don't have a ship? But like it completely ramifies into this kind of guardedness and hypervigilance that I feel other people listening to are probably they're picking up what I'm laying down here.
Yeah, I mean, it really feels like we are entering a moment where people are starting to think about like boundaries around information, maybe even more so like boundaries between people and sort of who in your life gets to know what. And like I feel like the most explicit version of that is like security culture, like in movement work, what have you, in a really obvious way. But then even just generally, like I feel like it's like with people getting detained and deported for writing op-eds in support of Palestine, it's like we're at a point where I think we're going to start to see boundaries discourse really just around information in a way that I think previously wasn't the case. But with respect to like the border stuff, which I'm sure we'll get into more, what's so remarkable about these pop psychology concepts is the way they just relentlessly jump scales. Like I feel like we have this kind of classic, I think it's like various left economic schools that I don't know very much about are always saying like, well, like everyone wants to think of the nation as a person with a budget, and like a nation is not a person and it doesn't have a budget and debt works differently.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it totally actually works that way in terms of pop psychology metaphors, where we start taking things that actually kind of quietly reflect anxieties at the level of geopolitics and using them as terms to make sense of our relationships with one another. So it does go the other way.
Yeah, no, and this is something that I wanted to say also in a similar vein that I so admire about your work is the way that like it takes these concepts that, you might have a certain amount of suspicion about, but that are also eminently useful, whether it's boundaries, whether it's soft skills, whether it's DBT, right? I loved that piece in the drift on DBT, and you denature them, but you also do it in this way that doesn't say like, don't find solace here, right?
Yeah.
Because like we are actually in need of solace in any form that we can get it. So I loved I should say in the present tense, the sort of like the way that you're like really unsparing in these investigations, but without ever losing sight of like the alleviation of suffering. To me, this is a word that I think is overused, but profound.
Yeah. I really come to love these concepts by writing about them in this deeply strange way. Like I was at a book event for Andrea Long Chu's new book, and she was talking about seeing the books that she critiques as worthy adversaries.
Yeah.
Like she doesn't want to write about something unless it deserves to be wrestled with.
Yeah.
Like there's kind of a pick on someone your own size element there. So I think we see a lot of think pieces around pop psychology concepts where it's just someone sort of knocking down something stupid. But I think that I try to engage deeply enough and to really like sink my teeth into the history of something to a point where I come out with like a deep respect for it. And I think what often happens in a way that I used to find shameful and now kind of enjoy is that 6 months after I write something, I find myself like suddenly having this weird reverence for it.
Yeah.
Like I have 5,000 words of critique of DBT, but I think, I've had a lot of friends who are going through DBT recently, and I think talking to them about it, they hate it. But then I hear about elements of their experience there, and I'm kind of like, wow, this actually is an extremely potent method if you want to do a particular thing. And I think the question with a lot of these phrases, methods, whatever, these things that get pulled into popular culture is really like, well, what do you actually want to do? Like there's kind of this, like maybe they'll be able to get you somewhere and we can talk more about that. But like, where do you want to go? And do you want to go where they're by default taking you?
Yeah.
Because I think what a lot of these concepts do is leave you in a place where like they want to take you somewhere and you may or may not want to go there. And they're kind of designed to hide from you that whole process of figuring out like what you actually desire. But the other thing I'll say, one of my colleagues, after I wrote the boundaries piece, affectionately described me as Gen Z Foucault, which was him.
Put that on your business card.
Yeah.
I know. So I really thought about printing business cards with that. Unfortunately, I am not Gen Z, so it felt like a lie. I missed the cutoff by about 2 years.
Right.
But, it was like Gen Z Foucault, parenthesis, derogatory, by which he meant I was like basically keyword mashing into Google Books for like, hundreds of hours. But yeah, I think that there's something really fun about the Pomo genealogy stuff, but I think I feel this intense obligation to not just do that and be like, look where this weird thing that we all kind of are annoyed with came from, but to really stay with it long enough to think about, what in this is actually, like has utility on a deep level for me, even if it's not psychoanalysis.
The Gen Z, I'm still digesting the Gen Z Foucault thing because I've been thinking very much as I teach Foucault in some other spaces about that Foucault question, like, why do you want to be free? Right? People love this idea of freedom. And that term is, of course, self-evidently attractive to so many people. And Lord knows on like an interpersonal level, I don't want to make someone less free or like do anything that might be described as taking away their freedom, right? At least I don't want to, I'm not going to chain someone into my basement or something, right? But also, it feels like part of the Foucauldian project is to say, well, this notion of freedom, or like the idea of freedom, this tag, this signifier, it not coincidentally emerges as a thing that both people want, but also that, becomes a watchword for the organization of states and the operation of the free market, et cetera. In other words, it becomes this kind of signifier that ramifies on all these multiple levels, and sometimes it tugs other structures with it. And part of what I take to be so valuable about your work across all these different articles is the way that you present various terms as being not just like purely floating signifiers, but as tethered somewhat, or they have a genealogy to them. They have some sort of grounding. They have implications. And that level of interrogation, namely, where do these come from in terms of processes of history? How do institutions use them? How do different discourses use them? Is not incompatible with the other thing that I think we've all been saying you do such a good job of, which is namely thinking about how individuals have a certain limited set of tools at their disposal. They only exist in particular moments in time. They can't produce like some other word, right? It's like, I can't like, Foucault doesn't like propose like, here's a new coinage, and he then proceeds to utter something entirely that no one has ever heard before in any language to name what the thing that freedom should be, right? And thus it ramifies on a very practical level in ways that, and I think this has to do with also like punching up and punching down, right? I think about people I know talking about how, for example, now we're back to the idea of information and who's like, am I betraying information about myself, or am I regulating information coming in? But people are like, I have to turn off my social media feed at a certain point because I have boundaries. And on the one hand, I can note the sort of world historical irony in the fact that sometimes what they're seeing are images from a war which the media is saying involves crossing borders, but actually what actually is the international legal status of the boundary between Gaza and Israel. But never mind that. They are invoking this term because that is the term they have to present themselves from being overwhelmed in a world of suffering. And it seems it would be unfair to be like, well, you spoke the word boundaries, or you refuse to make yourself available to this torrent of images of death 24/7. And to be able to do that type of critique of a term, but also not reduce people across vast power differentials to their use of the term, seems absolutely essential. Now more than ever, I think.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so delighted to introduce Lily Scherlis. Lily is a writer and artist whose work focuses on lay theories of personality and relationships. Her essays have appeared in Parapraxis, Harper's, The Drift, and The Baffler. She is a PhD candidate in English and Theater and Performance Studies at the University of Chicago. And before I welcome Lily, I just want to say that she came to our attention when she wrote this just tour de force essay on boundaries for Parapraxis a couple of issues ago. And that was why we invited her on the show. And since we have had the pleasure of reading more of her recent writing, that has all just been incredible. Lily, we're so excited to have you on Ordinary Unhappiness.
Thank you so much. It's a total honor to be here.
So we're going to do something like a little weird today. A little weird, like not weirder than usual for us, I guess.
A strange situation, if you will.
It will be a strange situation. Yeah, that will make more sense in a little bit. One of our favorite things to do on the show is get to talk to someone not only about their writing, but do a little like kind of collective pedagogy experiment. And I feel like in some ways we're going to be doing that today by talking not only about boundaries and that Parapraxis essay, but that we're going to spend the bulk of the episode talking about attachment theory. And I feel like, Lily, you're the exact right person to do this with, because as you said a little while ago, you fall in love with these flawed objects. And so much of what you do, I think, is you track the high low. And I think, if I'm reading you right, you're really, really interested in how these, often at first obscure psychological, psychoanalytic, in some cases, concepts make their way and come to actually permeate popular discourse and mainstream conversations. And in the case of attachment theory, the ways that we talk about relationships in these very, off the cuff kind of ways. Like this morning, I was thinking, my Spotify shuffled to a Taylor Swift breakup song. And I was like, oh, she's our national bard of anxious attachment.
Oh, yeah.
That's like that. You know what I mean? But so
true.
So we're going to talk about boundaries. We're going to talk about attachment. But throughout today, we're going to really look at the ways in which we colloquially, casually deploy these terms. And, Lily, I'm so glad to have you here to get to think about their origins and the more kind of hidden and obscured histories that attend not only their emergence, but also the ways in which we come to speak them and they come to speak us.
Totally. I mean, I think that maybe the most animating question in my work is what makes a particular metaphor seductive to a huge range of people. What's wild about some of these pop psychology concepts is that they just, traverse society in a way that I think few other ideological precipitates do. There's something about wellness and something about, the individual broadly that of course seems to kind of quote unquote transcend political difference. And I think we can argue about that. But there's this sort of way that concepts like boundaries kind of pretend a universality that makes them feel really suspicious to me. But at the same time, there is this kind of humbling question around in these really nebulous zones of personality and intimacy and this sort of fog that attends these concepts. What do we grab for to get purchase and to sort of be able to speak about them in shorthands that other people will understand exactly what we mean really economically, particularly when we don't necessarily, have the English PhD to be able to sort of take tweezers to Lacan. At the same time, that doesn't mean that these concepts are above critique because they're accessible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so can we get into this essay, Boundary Issues? I would love for you to sketch out a little bit of the argument of the piece for our listeners, and also tell us a little bit about how you got interested in boundaries, why this is such a seductive, as you say, metaphor, and why you think the rhetoric of boundaries became popular so quickly. And I will tip my hand also and say that I am particularly, as I think Patrick is also, particularly interested in this relationship that you play with throughout the piece. Maybe I should say work with. It's maybe
Play
more
is
serious than
great.
play.
Yeah. We love to play.
That you play with between the notion of boundaries and the idea that the self is a thing that is one's own property.
Totally. So I started working on this actually in 2021. And we were coming out of this moment in the pandemic where people were in pods, where people were suddenly being around their partners literally 24/7, when people were worried about invisible pathogen that could jump from body to body. And so we're relating to each other's physical presence very differently. And when interacting with other people felt acutely risky for a way wider swath of people than I think it does right now. And what was happening was that all of these dynamics were getting really, really messy for people. And I think, in my pod, I know, and I think for a lot of other people, we developed all of this optimism around trying to contract explicitly around this, where there was this notion where if only we could draw the right lines between us, could come up with explicit agreements, then we would be able to assuage just the basic gratingness of interacting with another human that up close, and like under circumstances outside of anyone's control. And I think in this moment, boundaries discourse really popped onto my radar as a way that people were just trying to get a grip, and trying to stabilize their distance from one another in a moment when everyone felt very out of control. But I was so struck by how quickly this term took on moral authority. Like there was this moment where if somebody texted you and included the word boundaries in the text, you would be like, "Ooh, I screwed up." And I think everyone at some point received something like that, and it was a terrible feeling.
I'm really at
But
capacity right now.
Not a
no,
suppose.
totally. Which of course sets up care as like a resource. Like care is like almost like I think of it as like a
A
fluid.
very finite resource.
Totally. That someone has a certain amount of. It's a zero-sum game and can give to someone else. And if you run out of your care for the week, then there's none left. And like everyone around you is screwed. And I mean, which I think is really interesting. And as we can get into the history of boundaries, like really starts to show up kind of alongside the feminization of labor, the rise of care work, where care, or at least the labor power to do care, is literally being commodified in new ways. So there is a really interesting historical resonance there too. But I got obsessed with the boundaries concept because it felt like it had no history. Like it felt like it was this common sense that implied that there was this substratum beneath human relationships where lines between people were pre-carved, and if they weren't being honored, then they needed to be reasserted. So there was this almost sort of secret ontology that everyone was supposed to know about and adhere to, and that some people were failing to regard as sacred, right? And you Google concepts like this, and I think this is true of a lot of pop psychology, and you turn up some Psych Today article by someone who says, well, like boundaries are this, like attachment styles are this, and it really ontologizes it. Like it sets it
I
up.
get those from like the health center at my job. They like send them out
Totally.
once a week to students. It's
Yeah.
like this is X.
This is X, as
Yeah.
if it's like basic science, as if it's proven, as if it's totally ahistorical. And I just find this profoundly sus, right? I think it suggests that like the words that we use to describe how we relate to each other are completely arbitrary, when in reality, they set up norms that then determine those relationships. And once you start to actually dig into this history, you start to really see some of those political resonances. So the moment that boundaries get really popular is the early 90s. And they become popular through a series of self-help books that come out kind of around 91, 92. And, one wonders like, okay, why that moment? And I feel like it really has got to have something to do with the kind of fetishization of free trade, kind of the rampant acceleration of neoliberalism, which of course involves sort of the breaking down of certain economic boundaries, but then conversely leads to the atomization of individuals, where you have this fantasy that people are these like, little units that are parachuted into like a social landscape where they interact with each other through exchange in a market and can be totally like separated from one another. And you have the Berlin Wall as this kind of spectacle of the breaking down of those economic boundaries at the same time that like other boundaries are being very clearly drawn. It's like the fall of the Soviet Union and sort of the breaking up of these blocks and sort of the reassertion of the nation state. So there's this weird ambivalence where some boundaries are going away geopolitically, other boundaries are being very aggressively reasserted. And it's almost like this gets mapped onto intimate relationships as sort of some kind of sublimation of geopolitical anxiety. But it's not as simple as, the world was getting cut up. And so we needed to like cut up our social spheres as well. And it's also not as simple as things were getting chaotic and becoming soup, and so we needed to play that out at the level of our social reality. It was a weird mix of both. But the way that I started to think about boundaries as referring to this property logic of the self just literally came from the self-help. So there's this book by these authors Cloud and Townsend, who literally write, quote, just as homeowners set physical property lines around their land, we need to set mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual boundaries for our lives. So it's literally there in the self-help. And I think there's this way that in a world that doesn't want to give most of us control over our lives or listen to our needs, et cetera, there's this way that it makes sense to appeal to property logic as a source of control and authority because, like, you know, as we've seen through, like, I mean, I think particularly of like the George Floyd uprising in 2020 is a moment that a lot of people were kind of coming into awareness of how property is the one thing that social systems are most determined to protect. And our institutions are set up to defend property in a way that they aren't set up to defend well-being. And so it makes sense to appeal to that logic in order to, you know, get what we might otherwise be deprived of.
I just want people to get a little snippet from this essay that uses this language here. So here's Lily. The problem with boundaries is that the world is designed to force us into financial and emotional dependence upon one another. And our primary metric for measuring the health of a relationship is being able to perform independence. Boundaries make dependence look like misplaced possessiveness. To survive and thrive, we are encouraged to unhook from one another, sealing ourselves off as individual cells rising the ranks of society. Your time and energy are something you own and lease out to others. Having good boundaries is enforcing the terms of your lease and abiding by the leases of others. Having bad boundaries is demanding squatters' rights, close quote.
What I loved about this essay, and I think this is also very much bears on other, I'm thinking here of your DBT essay too, right, is this historicization of contradictions as coexisting at the same time in let's call them dialectically, right? Or at least the dialectical logic is one where you could have two things can be true at once, right? In the era of, I don't know, NAFTA and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fact that information wants to be free and all these other things that we're sort of celebrating, people are also experiencing diminishing returns in terms of certain expectations, or at least an acute anxiety vis-a-vis their own, say, maintenance of work-life boundaries, or, you know, their capacity to enclose property qua private property over and against market displacements via, you know, losing jobs, et cetera. And in all these cases, you point to, but like how these articulations of these terms almost invariably seems to pop up in situations in which individuals are forced to account for themselves for a hurt that they're feeling. You know, as you very astutely say, part of what happens when someone says, I have a boundary here, is they're saying, I've been hurt, but I don't necessarily want to tell you what the hurt is, or like, I feel unsafe, but I don't want to tell you why I feel unsafe or where I'm going. But also it involves a kind of both an expression of these anxieties and also a being forced to take responsibility for the management of those contradictions, psychic and material, at the same time. And this theme of like continual psychic responsibilization, or like who has to do this work with these tokens, seems so true, I think, both in the way in which it captures, I think, the dilemmas that individuals have, but also how these terms really do reflect certain nostalgic, imaginary, but still, you know, existing logics about how like the world could or should work. And here I think the homeownership thing is particularly acute. And I'm really, the idea of homeownership as a metaphor for everything has been really, really sticking in my craw since the most recent Barack Obama intervention into the discourse about progress under Trump, right, where he's like, you know, he only occasionally comes down from the mountains of Maui or whatever to issue these sort of statements. And it was this thing about how, you know, in these times where there are all these distressing political developments, we forget, of course, it's the we, right? These collective articulations, which really, I'm like,
elided into that.
Yeah, it's the we as in we tortured some folks, but I was like, no, I'd never tortured anybody. Like, but never mind that. It's we can be reminded that progress is still possible, right? And the example, never mind too, that it's like, oh, we've gone from the arc of the universe bending inexorably towards justice to progress may still be possible. Reminder, right? It was, the example that he gave was the Affordable Care Act. He's like, we were able to do this. We pushed this through. Never mind that it's getting clawed back, right? But also like, He's like, the Affordable Care Act, that was like a starter home on the way to a broader healthcare program. And I'm just like trying to think about the amount of Americans who, the generational cadres of people who will never be able to own a home, let alone imagine what a starter home is. And then this is being offered to them in this kind of condescending, idiomatic way. It made me try to think in a dark way about like what the rhetoric of boundaries is going to be in the possible near future, where like everything is on the blockchain and like I'm like renting, I don't know, like I'm renting the bed I'm in and I'm renting everything about my time. Like I just don't have I'm sorry, but like I don't have the units of whatever to offer you right now. Like the timeshare on my psyche is so depleted. Like the EULA of our social contract, it just doesn't allow me to deal with you right now. But it does. It feels like a lagging indicator and yet a brutally dispositive symptom of processes of extraction, alienation, but also of like responsibilization and a kind of like pseudo empowerment.
Can I also go back? And this is like my like, I was going to say inner philosophy nerd, but it's pretty external, like showing is I kept thinking about John Locke as I was reading this essay, as one does. I was thinking about how Locke talks about how the first property is the self, and then how you get more property. And this is in the second treatise of government. And there's a line somewhere in there that's like in the beginning, like all the world was America, where the idea is sort of like America stands for this place where like no one owns anything. It's all ready for, people to show up and take care of it, of course, like, ignoring the fact that there were in fact people there when Locke is writing. And then the way that he says that you get more property after that originary property that is the self is that you mix your labor with it. Like, so like you there's some land, right? Because this takes place in this world of abundance, as it were. And you mix your labor with it, and then it becomes yours. And that's how you get your starter home.
Totally.
Yeah. So, I mean, it just made me think about the ways in which like our national political myths and the texts that underwrite them are also really baked in to this propertarian language that is there. Which also, by the way, I should say, like, we can investigate. I'm saying this not to the two of you, but to everybody, but like we can investigate boundaries without like I'm a person who's like, I'm all about boundaries in various ways. You know what I mean? I feel like I'm constantly in a process of being like, I can't take that on right now. I can't take that on right now. And of like the intrusion that is often real, right? The sense of like overwhelm.
I mean, the first thing is like to the cryptocurrency point, like I'm so excited for the world where we have Care Coin.
Oh my God.
I'm
like,
sure
we're
it exists if we looked it up right now.
I'm sure. And like the situation where we're like, using massive quantities of resources and fossil fuels in order to like, mine one Care Coin so that someone can give someone else a hug in the blockchain, it's like, anyway. But yeah, it's crazy because I think I'm also feeling like this is all happening at a moment where like so many of us cannot enforce a life work boundary, where like our labor is like flexibilized in such a way where like you do not go home, which I think also is so associated with like the rise of literal emotional labor and like all the way back to like, like 1980 Arlie Hochschild being like, well, when you're a flight attendant and you're taking crap from passengers all day and then you go home, like you can't just kind of like draw that line and shut that off. And I think we're seeing all these, obviously with gig labor versions of this, where there's almost this inability to draw those boundaries at all. And so we kind of hypercathect onto this metaphor in order to make sense of it. And of course, at this moment, when for many reasons, people are more dependent than ever, it becomes this virtue or this way of sort of signaling exceptionality to be able to perform independence within your relationships. Like that becomes kind of like the metric of relationship health is like, how independent can you be from another person? And it's just interesting in terms of this whole idea of owning yourself. Like, I think something that like is kind of nice about psychoanalysis is that like, kind of like principle one, like the unconscious, like you don't really own yourself. Kind of yourself owns you, actually.
In multiple senses, right? I mean, it's like sometimes it just owns you. You're like, oh no, I just can't believe I did that. But there is this like, I'm thinking too about how, and here I'm going to tie together some other threads from elsewhere in your work, and we'll include links to all this stuff when we post this episode. But the idea of like the work of boundary detection, like assertion, and then and maintenance, or like letting it down, it's a skill, right? Or at least it's presented as a skill that you can master, but also, and you said this in different ways in different pieces, so I won't throw too many quotes of you by you at you, but it's effectively like, here's a thing that should be natural, that you should have known already, that everyone does. It's essential and eternal in the human. But also, you need remedial instruction about it. Here's an email coming at you on a Saturday from HR about how you need to maintain work-life balance. And this is also a like quote unquote soft skill, like being able to be aware of boundaries, being able to like manage upwards and tell your boss, no, please, I can't show up on the weekend for unpaid labor, right? But that in any event, that kind of pseudo naturalizing of like personal quote unquote skills, and the through line that I'm trying to articulate in your work, right, is this way in which this is as you say, like the rhetoric of skills in general has shifted over the course of the era of deindustrialization, right? And the notion of skills has become ever fuzzier and fuzzier, even as the need of people to assert having different skill sets in order to deal with the gig economy, right? Or the mass layoff trends, or whatever it is we want to point to, has grown only stronger. And thus, like, boundary maintenance is like a thing that you have to report that you can do and show that you can do, the way I suppose you have to say that you know how to use Excel. Or something. Yeah. I just was doing our taxes, and so this is why I spent a lot of time learning how to do Excel, and then immediately forgot it. But it is this kind of like some combination of like self-capacity building, or like mining yourself for capacities while also foreclosing your own energies and like amortizing your own ability to learn and do things. And it all clearly responds to logics of precarity. And it requires like a self-economization in the name of flexibility that really is about, like, I guess, like an orthopedics of the subject, right? Which brings us back to Foucault, I suppose. But
an orthopedics of the subject. Yeah. And it's like literally being flexible is designated as a skill. It is like skill is this empty category that can subsume literally anything that can be like nominalized as a quality of a person into it in such a way that people become responsible for intensifying their own exploitation, like as a capacity they do or don't have. Like literally, like you can't create your own boundaries. Like not only does that mean that you're not going to be able to like, leave work at work, it also means that you are a deficient worker and therefore are going to be like fired.
And if you do maintain your boundaries, right? If you rub your boss the wrong way, then they can fire you too, right?
Totally.
So the contradiction is completely on you. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like all of these concepts just refer to this broader contradiction of like your life is predetermined by your circumstances or by the way that your parents treat you. And we'll get into this with attachment theory. But it is also your responsibility to fix yourself in the face of that futility.
Lily, I wanted to read one more bit from the piece and then see if we can talk about some of like the uses of boundaries now that we've thoroughly put some pressure on the concept.
Totally.
So I loved this. Here's a quote from Lily. A lot of us, me, my friends, try generally to live by models of intimacy pitted against possessiveness. Other people aren't objects to be controlled, many of us feel, refusing to apply property logics to our friends and lovers. To be possessive of another person, for instance, by controlling their sex life, is to fail to accept their separateness, to fail to respect the boundary between us. We try to acknowledge and then nudge away jealousy as a relic of a violent, expropriative regime. Boundaries rhetoric makes this actionable. But boundaries themselves, a key tool in this work, are literally based around relating to yourself like a plot of land you own. To be possessive of another person is to fail to recognize the boundary between their property and yours, to let your dog poop on their lawn, so to speak. If the cultural logic of boundaries is seductive even to those of us who do not like property logic, perhaps it's because social structures are constantly trying to take things away from us. The most obvious way to protect your scarce resources and threatened autonomy under this value system is to invoke its own rules and use its own special magic words. It doesn't feel like the right time to ask your neighbor to take down their picket fence when a SWAT team is surrounding their house, close quote. So, Lily, one of the things that you acknowledge in this piece is that you can get put in like a really awkward position by doing what you're doing, which is to say, critiquing the discourse of boundaries. And specifically, it makes people be like, she doesn't have any. But can you talk a little bit of like how far this critique extends, about its potential limits, whether you think there is any utility to the language of boundaries, or whether like the invocation of the language of boundaries inevitably ends up shutting down necessary acknowledgments of interdependence?
Totally. I mean, like the first time I like hung out one-on-one with the person who is now my partner, they showed up and were like, so I've read your boundaries piece. And I was like, oh God. And I'd literally never thought, but like in that moment, I was like, ooh, I have ruined my dating prospects forever reading this. But it's funny because yeah, all of my friends shy away from using the word boundaries around me as if I'm gonna like slap them on the wrist with a ruler or something. But my way of responding to that is to almost overuse the word boundaries. We're all kind of relentlessly inserted into conversation almost as a bit. I think it is really useful. I think it's particularly useful when we're talking about how to manage one's labor,
Yeah.
or generally like with like I think I will quote unquote like set boundaries with myself a lot, like where it's like, okay, if I know that I'm gonna get like swept up in this thing, like if I do kind of contract with myself around something, point being, I will use it. I think that what worries me about the concept is when this metaphor kind of metastasizes and becomes kind of this unquestioned logic that kind of takes over all of the other trickier, less ready to hand, less economical ways that we might want to sort of nuance the ways that we talk about our relationships in particular. So, like, my kind of alternative, my preferred way of narrating some of the phenomena around boundaries in my relationships is actually to think about transference and to think about how like my dynamics with the people closest to me are kind of overdetermined and populated by dynamics from the past, and how I can't really, none of us can like directly relate to people in my life except through things that I am bringing with me, and that like, my psyche is going to transpose onto how I interact with them. And so I think rather than being like, I can draw a line and thus maintain an appropriate distance from a person, I think I try to think about sort of like what in my experience of a person is getting reformatted by, stuff that is quote unquote mine.
Yeah.
And so I think that is sort of more the terrain on which I would start to think about differentiating, I don't know, myself from others, rather than thinking that there's some like literal line that can be drawn between us, or that distance and proximity is sort of a straightforward or sort of unidimensional element of relating.
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. I think we've talked on this pod. This is going to be like way out of left field, so just bear with me. We've talked on this podcast a little bit about like the Buddhist distinction between conventional and ultimate truth, and I think it's like actually pretty helpful here in thinking like, okay, like maybe you don't have a self, whether it's because you're thinking about it like you are, bundles of psychophysical aggregates that change over time and have no underlying essence, right? At the same time, right, that might be the ultimate truth, but at the same time, like I need to be able to call you something I need to be able to be like, you're Lily. And I need to be able to walk around, again, whether we're thinking about it in these sorts of terms or whether we're thinking about it in explicitly psychoanalytic terms, where like, of course, like the self is continually like haunted by and structured by the other, right? Like you are not yourself. You do not coincide with yourself. And I think that's true. But I also can't handle that at every moment of every day. And so where I would want to like, I don't want to say like rehabilitate, because I don't think I actually, like, I love this essay. I don't want to push back against it, although I am going to still keep using the word boundaries in my everyday life.
Samesies.
Is that I think it is a way, albeit with this propertarian logic underlying it, of expressing something fundamental about autonomy. And in a time when, certain people's autonomy in particular is under threat, you get the desire to say, draw that fence around yourself and be like, actually, I'm the only one that should get to make decisions about what's going on in my uterus, for instance. I'm thinking about, this is going to really, especially to our Gen Z Foucault and cohort. As soon as you said that's
never
sus,
have told you
I
that.
was like, well, you said that. You said that's sus, and I was like, oh man, that is Gen Z Foucault.
Yeah, I would have said sus.
We're leaving that in.
Yeah.
But this is going to really date me. But I have this like early memory of The Onion. When they used to do point counterpoint, and it was like point, like get your laws off my uterus. Or get your laws off my body or whatever. And then it was like counterpoint, and it was a general that was like, we must deploy troops to Jessica's uterus immediately. And like, that's one of those things where I want to be like, I don't know. Like, even if ultimately interdependence is really how we ought to be thinking about personhood, there's quite a lot to be said for having potent and easily intelligible metaphors that express agency and autonomy, especially for people who have historically had less of those.
The power differential seems so important here,
Yeah.
right? I'm thinking about like these tools are, or these words or these tags, or like they're kind of kludges, right? That they work in different ways transactionally to different ends. And what I particularly love about your appealing to transference is a more sort of diachronic and also synchronic concept with the capacity to think about like power and what's happening in a given moment and where that moment may go and where the participants in that moment are coming from, is that it points to how, there is a gulf of difference between, I don't know, being like, no, my boundary is I'm not having a second drink with you, right? Or like my boundary is we're not going to a second location, right? If that's what you need to say to get out of that situation, it would be it would be so fucked up to be like, no, actually, you need to go to that sketchy place with him. Like, no, you have to have another drink. Like that would be a sort of absurd erasure.
Or also, like, you got to do whatever it is that your in-laws want.
Yeah,
right?
Well, yeah.
You don't have to have boundaries. Like, it's fine. It's fine just to drop by. No problem.
This seems to me skating on very delicate ice here, but I will say
we don't live in that. That's an imaginary example.
But also think about like predators are interdependent with their prey, right? I mean, they need those creatures, and maybe they all participate in the carbon cycle, but also like there is a way in which, I don't know, if like a landlord wants to like show up and tell you about all the things that are wrong with their life, and then you're like, I'm really sorry, but I just got laid off. Can I have a week extension on the rent? And they're like, sorry, I got boundaries. Right? Like you have to show up there to listen, but then they're like completely inflexible.
Yeah.
Or the boundary stuff. And I think other metaphors may also be helpful here too. Some of the ones we've explored on the podcast, or even other concepts. Like I think our conversation with Jade Davis about empathy.
Yeah.
Right? Like
another like kind of denaturing of a concept that we think of as sort of like reflexively positive. Yeah.
Yeah. It like, to trope on the old Zizek joke, right? It's like, it's not like the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, or like the people who own the means of production and the people who are being like tossed into the gears of production can't be like, we have empathy for each other. And that's all we need to do. Like to the extent to which the terms ratify positions of power that are starkly antagonistic, they seem problematic. But also if they are the tools at hand to kind of chivvy out some degree of, well, use the language of wiggle room vis-a-vis psychoanalysis as being a sort of a different way of thinking about this, that then they seem to be useful. And I think that sort of, and we might even be able to say this about like the family too, is another one of these metaphors, right? Like, and the ways in which, I don't know, like maybe I would let my boundaries down for certain family members, but if my boss is like, don't worry, we're a family here, I'm going to tell you about what's wrong with my sex life. Now you tell me about what's wrong with yours. Then I'm like,
don't unionize. We're a family.
Exactly.
Oh, and by the way, this company is too small to need HR.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, okay, the thing I want to say here is that, I mean, I think about the weaponization of the border, and kind of who controls the border, right? Like policing institutions, the state, what have you, gets to sort of selectively decide where the border of the country is, and, you know, can carve out people like Mahmoud Khalil, right? Like, and can just decide that the border is like, can extrude them from it and can relocate it at will, as we are now seeing, right? And so it sort of is like, they get to modulate one quote unquote boundary, and sort of in the face of that, like, what can actual like random individuals do except be like, well, here's, you know, like I get to draw some lines, you know, even if that is totally dwarfed in scale by like this big, horrifying line that we're seeing be totally weaponized, right? And also, similar to personal boundaries, be like at this particular moment, the site of like a whole host of fantasies of like shoring up the nation, retaining it as like a property, logic, what have you, even as like that's attended by rampant atomization. Like I think we're seeing this perfect set of contradictions that almost precisely mirrors that early 90s moment where boundaries like exploded in 2025.
One thing that I think your work is extremely useful for readers, no matter where they're at, right? If they're in triage mode and using terms as best they can, or are finding other people's usage of those terms extremely annoying or off-putting or alienating, is that it allows us to sort of perceive patterns and resonances between the ways in which we as individuals, but also us as collectivities or relationships between individuals, have to confront a certain set of basic paradoxes about agency, about responsibility, about mobility, about our origins under capitalism, or at least just in the world, thrust as we are, right? We're coming from a certain place, and the open question of how much we can or can't change our circumstances over and against the baggage which we have been given, or the circumstances into which we have been born, runs up against the real sort of structural limits of our material reality, and also sort of the imaginary limits of our ideologies. And a through line, I think, and a consequence of that, is that many of these vocabularies, as you indicate, whether they be some of the logics or mantras that subtend something like DBT, or the logics and mantras that are involved in something like Dale Carnegie's self-improvement gospel, right, seem to be both useful and pernicious, depending on where you are, but precisely because of how they at once index these contradictions and also sort of promise a way out of it, right? This idea that, well, you may be doing some sort of like you may have been born a bootblack or like whatever, a street urchin, but if you learn how to influence people through being charming, you can become a Dale Carnegie, with a little asterisk about that he's not one of those Carnegies, but never mind that, right? Or that if you were born in circumstances of deprivation and emotional difficulty and stress, if you have the right terminology and you expose yourself to the right set of self-help books, that explains all the problems that you're having dating. But you can also develop a set of skills, whether through paying for therapy or through becoming an apprentice in like a self-therapeutic process. You can change that. And your work is an exploration of the double binds and contradictions, but also sort of the hope that sometimes can actually give people, and like the real purchase, because I think people can clearly change when they use the tools at hand to do that, is, I think, a wonderful way for us to talk about something that I know you've thought about a lot, and that also we haven't had a chance to address explicitly on previous episodes of the podcast, namely sort of this body of knowledge, this tradition of both like the study of development and of later adult relationships, and then also like the pop language of attachment theory.
And I know, Lily, you have work in process on attachment theory. And before we get into why, as you said before, I'm really kind of stuck on this phrase, like why we think of its metaphors as so seductive, right? And why the language of attachment and secure attachment and anxious attachment and avoidant attachment has become, as boundaries have, like so popular and such a like a go-to to explain ourselves and to other people. I'm hoping we can do like a kind of quick and dirty, what is attachment theory, in full knowledge that this is going to be like, I mean, this is a vast field. We are not going to be able to do justice to it, but perhaps before we like get just full into like I know we were talking to Hannah Zevan in an episode that just came out a few days ago about like BuzzFeed attachment style quizzes. Like before we get into that, maybe we can actually give listeners a little bit of a sense of like, what is this field? And, what are some of its key terms? And at least in the context of one particularly important item here, key experiments, which is to say the strange situation. So can we get into that? And then we can get into like why attachment style is like the new astrology.
So strictly speaking, to talk about attachment in the contemporary moment, and here we're bracketing the popular psychology dimensions of it and the self-helpy sort of how you identify on a dating app dimensions, is to refer to a field that is not strictly speaking psychoanalytic, or at least it was not in its origins psychoanalytic, and in fact exists in a kind of tension with it.
Vexed relationship with psychoanalysis,
and is in fact much closer to, at least in its origins, to, on the one hand, anthropology, but above all, ethology, right? The study of animal behavior, right? Because animals, we don't really know exactly what's going on inside their heads. Instead, we have to observe their behavior as over time revealing a certain repertoire of, dispositions, activities, etc. Right? This is where we get the idea of like imprinting, right? Why I shouldn't, I don't know, pick up a baby koala and take it away with me because it'll think I'm a koala mother or something, right? This idea that, like, in other words,
I think it's like a duck or a goose.
I don't know. I'm not handling any of those things.
Well, no, but there's this great line. Oh, I'm forgetting who it's from. It's from a Kleinian, I want to say, that's like, it's from Hannah Siegel, whose work is incredible on Klein, which is, what's the use to psychoanalyze a goose?
Oh my God. Sorry.
Sorry.
No,
it's important.
The point here, though, is that this is a discourse that's very early 20th century, and it's called ethology, and it's about the study of animal behavior, again, because what's happening inside animal brains is a black box, right? Mutatis mutandis, we could postulate that the interiority of what's happening in the brain of a baby is also, to a great extent, entirely black box. And though theorists like Klein will get a lot of mileage out of proposing models to sort of conceptualize that, and like, how do I narrate the internal tensions and cycle of development that is unfolding inside like the neonate, etc. The term attachment sort of like, in this broader sense, we would use it today, again, bracketing the pop psychological things, to talk about how you relate or the intensity of your relation or your quality of relationship to various figures who are important, right? Use more psychoanalytic language. Which of these are more cathected or not for you? Historically speaking, this is a discourse that emerges in the first half and then in a big way in the third quarter of the 20th century via British psychoanalysts, but also like British clinicians who leave psychoanalysis and then later come back into the fold, but in any event are affiliated with the Tavistock Institute or the Tavistock sort of model of thinking about group behavior, but above all, doing this practice of what's called like baby watching, right? And this is an attempt, in other words, to think about how development in children, and specifically relationships to primary caregivers, can be not made empirically sort of deterministic or empirically sort of verifiable in some ways, but at least to produce a way of thinking about behavior and the developmental process of these small human subjects from the outside. And more specifically, then, this involves the work of a figure like John Bowlby, who was actually sort of similar to Winnicott in some ways, right? Trains and has a military experience, and I think trains in psychiatry, and ultimately actually works for Winnicott for a while, but moves beyond the Kleinian model and actually is kind of put in bad odor by the British psychoanalytic for a period of time before going to the Tavistock group, where he interacts with, among other things, with Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, and with Conrad Lorenz, who's one of the founders of ethology.
I think he also is analyzed by one of the same people who analyzes Winnicott, Joan Riviere.
Yes, I believe that's the case. Yeah. And actually, he also then, in this period of detour of about 20, 30 years before he then returns to psychoanalysis and tries to integrate his findings into a psychoanalytic account, is actually involved in some of the cybernetic systems theory stuff, which is also very in the water at the moment and also in our conversation. In any event, he and then his most famous student, an American, Mary Ainsworth, produce a robust body of literature and a series of experimental procedures for typologizing and coding different styles of attachment, or for like looking at producing like a way of thinking about, through experimental means, the crucible of how a early infant, I think it's about a year is when most of the experiments happen, what is the quality of that child's, well, Bowlby will call it internal model of work. Sometimes it gets called the internal working model, which is an interesting sort of shift. But like, how does a child come to understand itself as a self in a dyadic relationship with a caregiver, in terms of the textures of what the child can expect in the way of care, how that child displays anxiety or security, etc. And then that will subsequently be put to work by further attachment thinkers to make claims about a developmental pathway that's more or less linear or less mirrored into adulthood and beyond.
Yeah. And let me just say also, before we get to the strange situation, that one thing I think is really salient here is like, these are empiricists, right? And they are interested in not only in something measurable, but they're also interested in like reality. Like, what is the reality of the child mother or child caregiver relationship? And so like, this is interesting. And because our listeners are who they are, I want to just kind of elucidate this for a minute. It's really interesting in something that accords nicely with Kleinian preoccupations is the like moving this key period earlier to like this first year and second year of the baby's life. But contra the Kleinians, who are so interested in like the psychic landscape, this terrifying psychic landscape of that baby, of the fantastical, like the world of fantasy. This is very much about like, what is the real nature of these interactions?
The attachment theories are like, y'all in psychoanalysis are just talking about fantasy. We're talking about real events.
Yes.
And this is happening like at a moment where like the psychotherapeutic establishment is turning to like quote unquote evidence-based practices,
right,
for reasons that are like, partly economic. And so it totally makes sense that attachment theory then becomes like, as I understand it, sort of this bedrock of common sense for social work in a way that, I don't know, psychoanalysis kind of falls out of in social work schools, at least according to my friends who've done it. But
yeah, absolutely.
It's worth saying, too, that just in terms of the institutional linkages here, part of the reason why Bowlby is so influential and why the claims made by attachment theorists have the currency that they do is because in the 1950s, he does work for the WHO, the UN World Health Organization,
yes,
and producing reports that are particularly about maternal care and mental health, right? You can imagine how in post-war circumstances,
specifically, right?
There's an investment in like, what is happening to all these kids, right? Or people in the wake of world historical trauma, how can they be better cared for? How can we make, a more thriving sort of human subject, but also how does that relate to the variabilities in terms of maternal well-being?
Right. And again, this is stuff that can be measured. And I'm calling back again to our episode that we just did with Hannah Zevin, who talks about attachment theory as a theory of deprivation, right? She says that attachment is a misnomer in certain ways. This is about like a thing that you can measure is whether or not the mother is there, whether or not this separation has happened, whether that's in the case of hospitals. And, it was not, for a very long time, like your kid went to the hospital, you didn't see them. Or whether it is in the case of children who have lost their parents. I guess I want to say like it's very much centered around studies, or it comes out of thinking about separation from or deprivation of the maternal bond and what comes from it. I wanted to read Ainsworth on how what comes to be known as the strange situation, which is like the most important laboratory test for thinking about attachment, and then what will eventually, make its way into BuzzFeed attachment style quizzes, but how it comes about. And so this is a quote from Ainsworth, who has been doing, by the way, like tons and tons of field work. She's doing it in Uganda, and then she's doing these longitudinal studies, and she's in the house, she's with the mothers, like there's almost like a participant observer quality to it. And then she's also doing this when she moved back to the States, and is at Hopkins and does this in Baltimore. And she says, I thought, well, let's work it all out. We'll have the mother and baby together in a strange environment with a lot of toys to invite exploration. Then we'll introduce a stranger when the mother's still there and see how the baby responds. Then we'll have a separation situation where the mother leaves the baby with the stranger. How does the baby respond to the departure? And when the mother returns, how does the baby respond to the reunion? But since the stranger was in the room during the first departure, maybe we'd better have an episode in which the mother leaves the baby entirely alone. Then we could see whether the return of the stranger would lessen whatever distress has occurred. Finally, we'll have another reunion with the mother. We devised this thing in half an hour. Close quote.
Listeners who are interested can search for strange situation footage on YouTube and actually have audio by Ainsworth et al. And you can see kids react with varying degrees of graininess depending on when the stuff is shot. Books that they may want to check out include, for example, this history of attachment theory and also sort of its applications that Abby just read from, which is Robert Caron's Becoming Attached, which I think started out as an article in Harper's now that I think about it, which is interesting. Yeah, there you go.
And it turned into a 400-some page book. So
yeah.
Can't live up to that.
Well, I'd read it if you were.
Thank you.
There's a solid series in the Routledge Basics series called Attachment Theory by Ruth O'Shaughnessy, Catherine Berry, and Rudy Delos, I think Karen Bateson. And then I would also strongly recommend, because it does a very fair treatment of it, the text that actually Abby's about to reading from, which again is a summary just of Ainsworth's own works, which is called The Myth of Attachment Theory, A Critical Understanding for Multicultural Societies, produced by Heidi Keller. And it's a very good text. And it just, again, this is not a slanted account of attachment theory that Abby's about to read. This is directly paraphrasing.
This is basically the protocols of the strange situation. I was reading the sort of, Mary Ainsworth being like, this is how we put it together. This is how we were thinking. And I wanted you to hear that kind of like her thinking and process. And now I want you to hear like the formalized version of it. Important thing to know is, and this is partly why I was talking about how Ainsworth's earlier studies come in a more fieldwork setting where she's going into homes. This is a change. And the idea is sort of, how do you do something in a lab that nonetheless tells you about how the baby and mother relate in the home? Okay. All right. So here are the protocols. 1, caregiver, mainly mother, and infant are introduced by an experimenter to the experimental room, 30 seconds. 2, caregiver, mother, and infant are alone. Caregiver, mother does not interact while infant explores, 3 minutes. 3, stranger enters, is silent during the first minute, converses with caregiver, mother during the second minute, approaches the infant during the third minute. Caregiver, mother leaves conspicuously, 3 minutes. 4, first separation episode from caregiver, mother. I should be saying / but I'm just not going to. While stranger's behavior is geared to that of infant. Maximum 3 minutes. 5, first reunion episode. Caregiver, mother greets and comforts infant, tries to settle him or her again with play, then leaves again, saying bye-bye. I love that bye-bye is in the protocol. 3 minutes or more. 6, second separation episode. Infant is alone, 3 minutes or less. 7, continuation of second separation episode. Stranger enters and gears behavior to that of infant, 3 minutes or less. 8, and this is the end, second reunion episode. Caregiver mother enters, greets infant, and picks up infant. Stranger leaves conspicuously, 3 minutes or more. So note that this is all quite short. The entire strange situation is recorded. And, Ainsworth and other attachment theorists, were able to analyze these by the thousand, right? And in doing so, they started to see some patterns.
We should say that what they're specifically looking at, and they're using footage for this, so they can cut it down to microsecond style moments where they're trying to track the baby's facial expression. They're trying to run stopwatches for how long a baby is doing X, Y, Z. They're trying to figure out how much the baby shows a tendency to explore, right? Are they engaging with the toys in a sort of soul-minded focus, or are they keeping a watchful eye on the other adults in the room? How does a child react to the departure of the caregiver? And the truth is they're generally much more interested in the second half of this stuff, namely, how does the child deal with the non-caregiver adult, right? Are they anxious? Do they cry? Do they really focus on the toys? And then how do they deal with the return of the mother, what's called the reunion? Do they lovingly run into her arms? Do they keep playing? Do they do something else? Right.
Yeah.
So
are they distressed? Are they angry? Yeah.
And all these things can then be coded in terms of the amount of time and also the ways in which babies will do their distributions of attention, and the character of their reaction can be, sort of gridded out.
So does anyone want to do attachment styles or the grid?
Yeah. So on the basis of this, you wind up like getting dumped into, the infant is slotted into one of 4 types of attachment, which like based on this very brief interaction, and I think this isn't established in the strange situation. I think it's later experiments that establish this, then predicts the way that they will engage with lovers and, intimates for the remainder of their life. So there are 4 types. And they are secure, which is the sole good type. And the secure babies, I think they cry. So they're upset that the mother's gone, but then they can be soothed. So they're able to receive care and successfully sort of re-regulate themselves and return to play, right? Okay. All of the other babies have problems. So second, there's what she calls insecure avoidant attachment, which later just gets shorthanded as avoidant attachment. Some of the more like newfangled adult focused texts use dismissant avoidant or dismissive avoidant. And these babies like basically don't care. Like they're just like, oh, mom's gone. Nope, whatever. And then they don't really care when she comes back either. Third, there's insecure/ambivalent attachment, which later I believe gets narrated as anxious attachment. And these are the clingy babies. And so they get really, really, really freaked out when mom leaves. And then when the mom comes back and tries to comfort the baby like cannot actually be soothed. And it's like they get real worked up and then kind of can't let it go. And then finally, there's disorganized attachment, which combines styles, is a combination of like anxious attachment and avoidant attachment, where basically the baby is just sort of confused and behaves in a variety of different ways at the same time. And the thing I love about this chart is that they're actually like ventriloquizing the baby. So for each of these types, there's this little paragraph on sort of what the child learns, and it's written in the voice of the baby. So the disorganized attachment one is, the person who is supposed to look after me is scary/hurts me and should not be trusted. I don't know how to get my needs met. Over time, I'll learn to control others or look after others so that the world feels a little bit more predictable. So I just love that. I don't know. I think the language here is kind of lovely.
It's interesting because Bowlby and Ainsworth, and Bowlby in particular, with this notion of, again, the internal model of work, which again is also called, and much more in the contemporary moment, is the internal working model, right? The work of work is an interesting thing I think we could lean on a little bit, right? Is articulated almost as like a kind of like a dialectical process of becoming. Right. And the secure attachment is the one you want to work from, I think, to understand the others. Is sort of like a basic idea. And it's the child knows that it can expect love. Right. Because what we're tracking really is the way in which, and here I'll use a little bit more psychoanalytic language, does the child have the sense of security to do things like explore the world, engage in play, and then know that it can return to what Bowlby calls a secure base in the figure of the mother? And in other words, it receives satisfaction of, what we might call like its primary or basic needs. Right. And so one way Bowlby will frame this is in the secure situation, the child, and again, it's hard to, I realize I'm struggling on this because in some ways, like it's a dialectical process, right? And also this raises the question of like, what is being tested here really? Right? Is it about the child? Is it about the mother? Is it about the two of them? Is it about the two of them in this situation, et cetera? But like it's the child in the secure situation seems to be capable of understanding, per Bowlby's understanding of ethologically what's happening here.
Yeah.
That the child can receive security / love, and therefore it is lovable because the mother is dependable and shows it love. In other circumstances, i.e. the mother doesn't show up, or like the mother is resented or whatever it might be, the child develops a different sort of working model of what is not just what can happen in the world around it, but where it stands as like a self object in relation to others, right? Is it safe? Will it only, I don't know, will it only get picked up by the mother once it stops crying, right? Will it have to like have a stiff upper lip and keep playing even when mom is gone? Are other people kind of like hot swappable, interchangeable? Like you'll occasionally get babies who will be like much more interested in the stranger as opposed to the mother.
They're like hot desking, but with people instead of desks.
And ideally, this is a thing that is run at multiple points during the child's development, and particularly during those early years. And the claim, at least empirically, is that there is some degree of consistency in the styles that the children show. Whether or not that is culturally bound is a major question. Likewise, Absolutely. The question of how that is diachronically. And I will put in the word from Margaret Mead, who we could say other negative things about, but one thing that is sometimes glossed over in these histories is that she, anticipating what many other subsequent researchers do, actually registered some issues with Bowlby's claims about universality, and specifically refer to other sort of social circumstances where actually it wouldn't just be a single mother doing this type of caregiving. You might have other people, and he kind of steamrolled over that.
Yeah, of course. And so like the mother becomes this central figure.
We're not doing psychoanalytic mother blaming. That's one thing we're not doing. Thank you for hashing through this with us, Lily. And part of the reason why reading your other work was felt so generative and a nice segue into thinking about attachment theory, and why we wanted to think about it with you, is that it does seem like these types or these sort of ways of being, which are also ways of adapting to the environment, could be seen as like, what are this child's skills, right? What does it have a tendency to do? How does it deal with where it's coming from in relation to where it's going?
Right. And how has its relationship with its mother equipped it?
Yeah.
Let's not forget the centrality of the dyad to this, right?
And much in the same way as a lot of your work seems to chart like the ways in which, as you do, I think we've established the nuance of it, like in your accounts of CBT and DBT and all these other modalities are sort of about how much can the subject working on themselves as a project navigate changes in workplace employment or broader world historical circumstances that make the subject their object. How flexible can the child be? How flexible can the worker be? This notion of attachment types or the predictive power of attachment, well, I mean, let's stipulate first, there is this odd thing where it's like, we're going to fungibly swap in figures. Are your attachments fungible? Can we like teach you to adapt to different circumstances? But also, can you change your attachment style through doing additional work, whether in therapy or otherwise? And again, the connection becomes so much more organic once people are familiar with your work. You see it proliferating across all these discourses, from the employment market to, I guess, like the dating scene. And so, yeah, let's run with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we talk, and Lily, I'm going to ask you, because I know that you're just, I loved reading this paper, which is not not published yet, but it is a work in process about attachment. And it is about like, and for my sins, I did read one of the books you sent over. The book you sent over that's just called Attached. And I peeled all 300 pages of it in 2 hours or something like that. But, it really, I was being flipped before when I said like attachment is the new astrology, but like, I don't think it's totally wrong. And so I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the popular conceptions of attachment and attachment style. And I will also take this moment to confess that we did, by way of research, go and take a series of attachment quizzes. We took the BuzzFeed one, which was just about your current partner. And then we took one from attachmentproject.com. Is that what it was?
Yes. Don't open your email yet, Lily, but in a second, I'll ask you to open your email.
Oh, yeah. Don't open it yet. Yeah. So that asked questions about your relationship to your mother, your father, and your partner, if you have one.
And we want to encourage listeners may want to take some of these. I will just say, because
with a grain of salt.
Well, yeah, but also take them too, and they're fun. I mean, I will also say too, and this is that double-edged sword, right? Showing that both like a kind of humor towards these things and a critical stance toward these things, yet also a awareness of how they kind of do run up against actual realities.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It can be painful to do some of the more in-depth ones for people who have certain experiences. And it's also worth saying that it's odd how a school of thought that positions itself so against psychoanalytic accounts of like life history as being determinative requires you to first talk about your infantile attachments before then talking about your adult ones. And there's a way in which, I don't know, you may have a more skeptical attitude towards your adult attachments simply after having done those first questions.
Yeah. But I think, look, I don't want to make light of attachment theory at all. I think there's something very profound, especially about the notion of dependence at its center, that you need to bond in this particular way, and that independence, we were talking about autonomy before, and with respect to boundaries, the condition of possibility of genuine independence is having that full experience of dependence and safety. I guess I'm basically I'm admitting that I test is securely attached on every one of these. Yeah, we were sitting on the couch and taking them together, and I was like, I'm securely attached, and Patrick was like, yeah, I fucking know.
Yeah, like go fuck yourself. I also took the BuzzFeed quiz this morning, and I also got securely attached, even though the BuzzFeed quiz explicitly says don't brag about it. And when you get securely attached on this quiz, all of this confetti suddenly rains down, and you're like, oh, amazing, I can do intimacy. And then you're like, well, then why did I throw that tantrum the other day? I guess it doesn't fix everything. But okay, I have a lot of skepticism about attachment styles. I think that, and Danielle Carr actually has a really good sort of straight up takedown of attachment styles. And I think I have more ambivalence than she does. That's in Gawker from a couple years ago. But
yeah, we can link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, great. But something I do really like about it is that it's this reclamation of dependence. Like I'm pretty sure that Bowlby explicitly reaches for the word attachment specifically to kind of revalorize dependency. Like dependency is sort of a negative personality trait. Attachment is a style of relating that for him actually refers to a bodily system that, in this case, unlike in psychoanalysis, is totally separable from sexuality and is like on the order of like, like food or water or like breathing. Like it's like a physical mandatory thing that we all have. And I think I kind of love the way in which, albeit while appealing to like, positivistic science, yada, 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 like it takes really seriously human relationships as totally foundational, and makes them legible within those ways of talking. Like, despite all the problems I have with it, I think it's like this way of like, losing your object is a form of starvation.
Yes.
And I think we experience it as such. Like, I think one reason that these styles are so seductive, or attachment theory broadly in all its popular incarnations is so seductive, is because it really gives expression to some of these feelings of like total desperation that show up when people, get dumped or whatever.
Do you want Lily to open her email?
Well, I should say On the upside, the
Oh
BuzzFeed
boy.
test had me very securely attached to my partner, for which I'm very grateful.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. I got a different result, and I got a
From
packet.
theattachmentproject.com, the
Yeah.
more elaborate test.
Yeah, and quite a packet. Here, Lily, you can open your email and check this out.
Should I,
Yeah, please.
okay.
I took a screenshot.
Oh my God. The subject line of this email is boo! Exclamation point. Wait, this is wild.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Wait, okay, this is so embarrassing. I don't know who this is.
I have no idea who it is either. I think it's some poor stock photography model who just like doesn't look so great and has a couple scars on his face. And that is the person that they gave me against a bright red
It's
backdrop.
all red. Yeah.
You
I
have to tell me
got
what-
like a
yeah.
nice teal one that was like, congratulations. Like you can do no wrong in relationships. And I was like, really?
Yeah.
That doesn't quite seem true.
And I know you can't determine what a person's like psychological state is or like their mental health history based on how they looked. However, if this person walked into my office presenting like this, I might be a little bit worried about them. In any event, yes, I'm anxiously avoidant, disorganized, which actually is what I get on most of these tests. So I there is, I think, actually grain of truth to that. But it didn't feel great to receive it.
We all are.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to cut you off.
No, it's fine. It's yeah.
Yeah. It's just attachments disorganizing. It's a little chaotic. Like, I think really what this is like, I mean, spoiler, like the way that I've kind of come to think about this is like it largely shows up like as a matter of roles is maybe like a less fatalistic way to think about it than types, where it's like, the way that I kind of think about it or prefer to is like as kind of like a game of tag where like someone's someone's like the anxiously attached person, like chasing the other person who's like running away, and then they get tagged, and then the other person's it. And so you can kind of swap out. But like ideally, one person in a relationship is not like eternally the anxiously attached one chasing the other. Like you're evenly matched enough that you can kind of like trade off. And also ideally, you're not playing tag all the time, right? But like I think there's this way that like the securely attached figure becomes a messiah within this way of thinking. Like all of these books, like Attached in particular, has this refrain of like, dump your partner if they're anxious or avoidant or disorganized and go find a secure one, because securely attached people are experts in effective communication. They are capable of, quote, turning off upsetting emotions without becoming defensively distant. They don't care, yada, yada, yada. Basically like the secure among us are these messiahs that are going to save us from ourselves. And also, if you are not secure, you can become secure.
And I think that this is, I found myself thinking about how that sounds so much like what I've heard. Occasionally these things have a way of, regularly these things have a way of going viral, right? Like the person being like, if all your friends aren't equally or more on their grind set than you are, you don't have the right friends, right? Or like if you're an 8 and you're hanging out with a bunch of 6s, get rid of them, right? There's this kind of like rough sort of, it's not even really advice. It's more like imperative injunction that you are doing something wrong. And that combined with this way in which it's like, well, you came from somewhere wrong. And also, at the end of this PDF that they sent me was like, if you pay us $49, we will give you a workbook that you can improve your attachments. It made me think about how like, well, this bit in your DBT essay as well about the woman who is, and I have granting a lot of respect to Linehan and the way in which DBT I think can save people in certain circumstances. The woman who is going into therapy trying to learn skills so that she could get her husband back. And
Cindy is the name of, this is a case study from the 90s, one of the like early major case studies in the formulation of DBT with a patient who's referred to as Cindy.
I don't even know how to say this, right? But like the ability to get the skills, well, she doesn't, he remarries, right?
Yeah.
And she ends her own life. And what I found myself coming back to there, and I think this is, if you'll allow me to like try and name what I think part of what I find your project speaking to in a very profound way, right? It is this way in which let's call them attachments, right? Or certain relationships are not actually like fungible or simply acquiring a certain set of skills will not allow us to simply replace the specific other whom we love with another other with a competitive set of traits.
People are not just exchangeable. And I also think that like something that really bothers me about the way that they try to make people become securely attached is that it really focuses on communication skills.
Yeah.
And obviously, I like deeply believe in cultivating thoughtful strategies of communicating within relationships. At the same time, I think there's this fantasy that through raw virtuosity of communication or through a couple of sort of straight up protocols, deeper asymmetries and compatibilities, whatever, can simply be bridged over. And you can become a person who is capable of securitizing any attachment or dynamic you might find yourself in. One element of the thing I've been working on around attachment styles is that so much of where these conversations live is in online communities, particularly Facebook groups and Reddit groups.
Yeah.
And basically what happens is like tens of thousands of people, most of whom seem to be anxiously attached women, come together to complain about their male partners
The
who are
avoidant
usually
man.
either
Yeah.
quote unquote dismissive avoidant, or as Patrick seems to be, fearful avoidant. Sorry, I
No, it's
mean,
okay.
I think we all are, as I
Enough
said,
about my inbox.
but
No, sorry.
but I
Oh
think
God,
people
Patrick.
find. Wait, what
Sorry,
did you
sorry.
say?
He made a joke about how he never answers email, which is totally true, which is why I do send out all of the email for the podcast.
No, I have a strange situation every morning. It's basically my phone is constantly on do not disturb now.
Yeah. I have a disorganized attachment style, but only to my inbox. Yeah.
This is true though. There's truth in this.
I mean, I anxiously check it, and then when something arrives, I avoid it.
Or I'll disassociate midway
Well,
between reading them.
I mean, guys,
no,
I do think that we are really proving that there's something to attachment theory because I just answer my email.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry.
Wait, okay. If this goes on air, for the record, BuzzFeed told me I was securely attached.
Congrats.
I think if we're gonna do like the kind of boundary style critique of attachment theory, there's a way that this does port to our relationships to institutions. Like I
Yes.
think that more and more, and this is something that I say in this sort of in progress piece, like our relationships to like our employers, our housing, the state, the literal freaking planet, have been trending, I think, for most people, either towards anxiously attached, like, oh no, I might lose any of my access to any of my resources at any given moment, or towards avoidantly attached, which is like, okay, I have enough and I don't actually have to care about what's happening to any of these things or to anyone else who's like, dealing with those things. And I'm in fact going to avoid those people and their needs. And so I feel like it's like, particularly since 2008, like it makes sense that, which is like, yeah, so these self-help titles by and large became like the classic Attached book came out in 2010. There's another 2012 book. I actually learned about attachment styles from Polysecure, which is a 2020 book, which uses attachment styles to like help people learn how to be in poly relationships without becoming jealous, which was circulating in my friend group in a way that I think everyone both found hilarious and was at that moment aspiring to like eradicate jealousy from their repertoire of feelings they would have about other people, in a way that I think sometimes became slightly hubristic.
So is it like the ethical slut plus attachment theory?
Literally that.
Okay.
Precisely that. Yeah, but I think that, I mean, one thing that I think, particularly at sort of like heated moments of protest, is we start to see people relate to institutions as these attachment figures. So, like, the more revolutionary among us are like, whoa, okay, I'm like differentiating myself, like there's like, whereas like we see other people, particularly, in this moment, Zion is sort of like clinging to the stability of certain institutions in the state in order to like keep a sense of like being upright or securitized in a moment where like otherwise they may be like threatened in their basic precepts of how reality works, right? So that's kind of my boundaries ask, like we have ported macro world historical problems into our intimate lives. But I also think there's just like being in love is really difficult. We start to see really scary sides of ourselves. We start to behave badly. We start to be like needy or clingy or withdrawn, and I think this happens to most people, even when they are securely attached at some point in a given relationship. And it's a really nice explanation to be like, well, I'm this kind of person, in the same way that you would be like, okay, well, I'm a Cancer Gemini cusp, like, and I think that in these Facebook groups that that so many people are turning to for support around their relationships, there's this intense comfort in saying, okay, my partner, usually a boyfriend, who is behaving weirdly, is rejecting me, is ignoring me, is not providing comfort because he's like emotionally incompetent because of like how people are socialized normatively per gender, whatever, is not doing this because he doesn't love me. And he's not doing this because like he is individually defective. He's doing this because he is a member in like a whole category of people who are constitutively broken by their parents. And either like I can learn all these techniques from people who are in the same situation as I am, who I can communicate horizontally about this too. And these techniques will help me fix him so that I can stay with him, which is what I want to do. Or there's a secure lover waiting out there somewhere for me, and all of these fellow anxiously attached women in like this, in my stereotypical gender normativized account of this, are going to help me leave because they've all been through this. So I think there's this sense of sort of like solidarity that comes from type that makes people's experiences of rejection in particular feel legible to them as not about them as individuals.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
like, I certainly don't think that attachment theory is immune to critique, right? But I also think it's important to say that we're dealing with something here that is different than like the rhetoric of boundaries, and that is certainly different than astrology, right?
Mhm.
And I think that anybody with psychoanalytic commitments, and this is partly why I was drawing out both the ways in which like some of what attachment theory started doing with its interest in like the very young child like sits like uneasily closely to Kleinianism, even though because it with its emphasis on the real as opposed to the psychic, it's at the same time like it was anathema to the Kleinians. Is like there's a there, right? Like I certainly don't want to dismiss any of these empirical studies, although of course there's a lot that like I think you are already introducing so many different factors in the ways that one might interpret, say, how children go through this strange situation. But I also don't think there are people that will never be in a Facebook group being like, let me fix him. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's definitely true. And I think like you can walk around and be and think. And I mean, I'm certainly not putting myself in this camp because like I literally like teach philosophy for a living. Like that's like my job is to sit around and worry about things that a lot of times we want to like put out of consciousness about like our place in this world and existence and all those things. But like some people do sit more easily in this world, right? Some people do bond more readily with others. Some people have faith that like a person who says that they love you just loves you, right? Instead of trying to be like, I need to text the group chat and be like, what does this mean? Right? They're just like, it means what it means. And I think that we can take all of that seriously while also thinking about the ways in which security and insecurity as like the blanket terms here, right? So it's weird when you talk about attachment styles because there's only one good one. There's secure, and then everything else is some variety of insecure, right? Whether it's anxious or avoidant, and the terminology changes over time. There's something about that speaks so much to like in this moment of overwhelming precarity, who can nonetheless kind of like, who's not getting completely knocked down by it. And we've done on this podcast, like talking with Jay Chaudhry, we've also talked about, like doing some of this work of denaturing with the language, like resilience. But there are also people who get knocked down by things that wouldn't faze other people. And I think there's a fundamental psychoanalytic insight at the heart of attachment theory, which is that like your early experiences with others predict your later experiences with others. That's not wrong.
Maybe another way of thinking about this, right? And here I'm thinking about some of the critiques that have been done of attachment theory by the figures I'm specifically thinking about are Robert and Sarah Levine, who I think have done work throughout I think it's Africa, Australasia, and I think maybe even in Tibet and Central Asia, right? And part of their claim is that in the book is "Do Parents Matter?" is the most recent one, which is interesting, right? And it may also bear on people, listeners who have thought about like family abolition in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Their claim is that attachment theory, as it is understood in the present, right, and also in its genealogy, for all its claims to wide traction. I think it was 400,000 copies of that WHO report are produced in like 15 different languages, right?
Yeah,
And
it had really major real world effects in terms of like not keeping hospitalized children from their parents.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it is still a output and an artifact of capitalism and of a capitalist interest in the family that is above all related in a more or less explicitly moralizing way to the concerns of the middle class family and reflects the pressures and contradictions under which that is under. And at that point, I think it might be worth saying that, and here again, I'm thinking about all your work, which is I'm going to be thinking about for so much longer, and I hope our listeners do too. It helps navigate this because it's difficult to say and think about, but like we are vulnerable to one another in so many organic and urgent and like let's call them existential ways, and we are vulnerable to one another or we're vulnerable just to chance and luck and I guess genetics, but also like the environment. Like there's so many different things that can result in a person's being hurt or harmed that it's hard not to see how under a regime of social reproduction that really magnifies and hypertrophies and piles on additional modes of vulnerability and competition and harm and that exacerbate the former, right? The child that needs additional care because of some sort of developmental disability or whatever, right? Can't has a mother who then is fired from a job and takes up drinking or something else like that, right? There are all these different ways in which like the second nature or like the secondary order of let's call it like contingent evil like piles upon the cruelty of nature as it's red in tooth and claw that you can't help but like understand why people want to reach for some sort of doctrine, but also toolkit for understanding this is why this other person is suffering. This is why they hurt me. If only I can do XYZ, then I will arrive at a place where, well, we'll call it security, but what I really want is safety.
Yeah.
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 I really want something other than change. And thus these slippages, are so pernicious and monetized at every stroke, right? But like it's worth saying, like just because someone the other you may encounter another who is securely attached, that doesn't mean they won't still treat you like shit, right? I mean, there are plenty of hell. I was just thinking about like for reasons I've been on a kick of reading Richard Evans's Studies of the Third Reich and stuff, right? But like I don't know, like Heinrich and Margareta like Himmler were pretty securely attached, at least for the first half of their marriage, right? Goebbels and Magna, not so much, right? But like, just because a person exists within a certain network of ties and dependability where they seem to lavish this one other or like a set of others around them with a set of affection doesn't mean that that's not all conditioned around a vicious exclusion of other people from the pale of humanity itself. And that is, again, that there is this sort of appeal here that I guess I'm trying to make, in which I hear your work is doing, to be like, well, we don't have to rely on shoddy tools continually to confront these ways in which we are already too vulnerable and are taught to hate dependence and despise need. And I don't know if this is, I'm sorry, I'm just losing my words at this point, but I don't know.
I had this strange experience the other night of having a friend ask me extremely directly, "Do you believe that pop psychology helps people?" And I like was weirdly, I've answered this question any number of times, but I think on this particular night I was like very silenced by it, particularly just in the face of everything that's been going on. And I think the degree to which like people in my network are just suffering right now. And I wound up remembering this Adam Phillips essay called "On Getting the Life You Want." It's in the London Review of Books, and he's writing about Richard Forty, who's doing this sort of, I think in like the 80s and 90s in particular, this sort of revival of American pragmatism. And American pragmatism as he writes about it, holds that you should use any ideas, you should believe any concept that helps you, that you can use, that gets you closer, as he puts it, to the life you want. So basically, ideas get measured on the basis of their utility. And Phillips, like, very diplomatically kind of comes in and says, well, for psychoanalysis, like, how the hell are you supposed to know what life you want? Like, Rorty just kind of presumes that desire is straightforward in this way, and that, like, obviously there's this thing called the good life. And capitalism, even though I think Rorty's like kind of at least nominally a leftist, I don't totally know. Like, capitalism tells you what that is, and then you go and you try and get it. And Freud, meanwhile, would be like, well, kind of the whole problem is that your desire might be opaque to you. And I love this essay. And I think for me, this is really how I understand the thing with pop psychology, which is like, it's designed to help you get the life you want. Like, it does work. It is a set of ideas that by and large will aid you in getting closer to the good life, even if the good life is sort of fundamentally structurally out of reach. These concepts are designed to help you adapt to the situation as it is. At the same time, like, they erase other possible shapes the good life could take, other possible forms of desire, and B, in just a less utopian register, they erase the way that, for most of us, quote unquote, the good life is permanently out of reach. But, within that gap, they do help you maneuver.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been delightful, and more soon.
Ciao.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye.
Folks, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Our podcast is entirely supported by the generosity of our Patreon community. It's what makes the show possible and keeps it ad-free for everybody. If you would like to support the show and get 2 additional Patreon episodes per month, please head on over to patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Lily Scherlis. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.